Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary films, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. And if you enjoy this show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app, and please leave us a review and a 5-star rating. Thank you. In this episode, I'm going to be dipping back into the ever-expanding archive of writing on the Klassiki Journal, which you can find at klassiki.online/journal. Today, I'll be reading an essay on the Slovak director Juraj Herz, best known for his controversial and politically charged 1969 horror film The Cremator. Herz remains the great outsider of the Czech New Wave, a Holocaust survivor who mined his personal trauma to produce some of the most striking gothic visions to be found anywhere in communist-era cinema. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to find the original essay, to browse our collection of Czech and Slovak titles, and to explore some of the films mentioned in this episode. What is the greatest horror film to emerge from communist Eastern Europe? For many connoisseurs of the creepy, there can be only one answer: Juraj Herz's 1969 classic The Cremator, the most purely disturbing title of the Czech New Wave, and an enduring vision of the depravity lurking just beneath the surface of bourgeois respectability. Herz's adaptation of Ladislav Fuchs's novel of the same name is set in 1930s Prague, and charts the descent into madness of one Karel Kopfelkingel, played by Rudolf Hushinsky, a respectable crematorium worker and paterfamilias who embarks on a murderous spiritual mission that blends bastardized Buddhism with the ideology of National Socialism. While fully deserving of the horror label, the unassuming Kopfelkingel is more than a match for the rampaging villains of slasher franchises. The Cremator, like all of Herz's films, transcends narrow genre conventions, blending the pitchiest black comedy with surrealist flair and biting satire. It also draws on the trauma of his own life as a survivor of the Holocaust, an experience that would shape all of the director's work until he was finally able to tackle that history directly in Caught by the Night, the 1986 concentration camp drama that Herz described as my greatest horror. The Cremator is by far Herz's best-known film outside of his homeland. Its reliable inclusion in lists of the masterpieces of the Czech New Wave has canonized Herz as part of that movement, which still defines outside understanding of cinema from the region. Released mere months after Warsaw-packed tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, the film stands for the kind of politically and philosophically daring filmmaking that was curtailed by the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968. But while The Cremator was eventually removed from circulation in 1973, Herz's career was far from over. Far from being a new wave poster boy, he was Czechoslovak cinema's great outsider, a position that he exploited to maximal effect. Over 2 decades marked by constant intrusion and obstruction from the authorities, Herz pursued the singular and gothic vision first realized in The Cremator, an expressionistic world undone by forces beyond rational control. His resourcefulness and bloody-mindedness, no less than his ability to adapt his macabre worldview to the demands of the material in front of him, produced a body of work that deserves to be better known. Herz's upbringing as a Slovak Jew would shape his life in ways both minor and horribly profound. Born in Kežmarok in 1934, his family were arrested and interned by the country's collaborationist fascist government during the Second World War. Herz was held in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. While he and his immediate family survived, some 60 members of his extended family were murdered. After this ordeal, he would eventually go on to study photography in Bratislava, before making the move to Prague, where he enrolled in the puppetry department of the theatre faculty of the Academy of Performing Arts. Here he would befriend what he called his cosmic twin, the great animator Jan Schwankmajer. The two were born on the exact same day in the same year. Schwankmajer's fantastical and metamorphic creations later found live-action counterparts in Hertz's own films. Hertz's personal and professional background kept him at the fringes of the burgeoning Czech film scene of the 1960s. The Czech New Wave was closely associated with Prague's more prestigious FAMU film school, a milieu in which the Slovak puppeteer Herz struggled to establish himself. In a 2002 interview, he recalled being chased out of screenings held by FAMU students at the time. His attempts to adapt the Bohumil Hrabal novel Closely Observed Trains were thwarted when the project was instead handed to Jiří Menzel. His friend Jaromír Jureš attempted to include Herz in the 1966 anthology feature Pearls from the Deep, often considered the manifesto of the Czech New Wave and the launching pad for careers of the likes of Menzel, Vera Chytilová and Jan Nemetz. But Hertz's contribution, titled The Junk Shop, was excluded, becoming his first standalone short in the process. Herz was forced to learn his trade on the job, dependent on the mentorship of sympathetic establishment figures like Zbigniew Brynich and Jan Kadar, under whom he honed his technique as an assistant director. Hertz's taste for the macabre was on muted display in his feature debut, the psychological murder mystery Sign of Cancer from 1965. But it was given full voice 4 years later in The Cremator. That film was only made possible by the liberalization that accompanied the Prague Spring. During shooting, Herz later recalled, it became clear that this was a unique chance which wouldn't come again. At this formative moment in his career, Herz recognized in Fuchs's novel a delicate blend of gruesomeness and wit that matched his own worldview, and he threw his creative energies into realizing it on screen. As he later said, "When I was working on The Cremator, I knew that it was the right thing to do. It is my feel for comedy, my feel for something that could be called horror comedy, even if I don't take it as a pure horror film. I think it is more a psychological thriller or psychological horror." Herz was right that The Cremator would prove a one-off. Like many others, he contemplated emigration after the events of August 1968. Ironically, he was prevented from doing so by his need to finish shooting the film, which was delayed by several months while leading man Kruszynski was in hiding, somewhere in a factory, in Hertz's recollection, following his activism during the Prague Spring. Instead, like Menzel and Chytilová, he would stay in Czechoslovakia, and the following 15 years were spent pursuing his gothic cinematic ideal through the labyrinth of the state studio system, a web of commissions, political pressures, and personal animosities. Somehow, though, Herz was able to turn this precarity into opportunity. Stories set in the present day were politically fraught, so Herz sought solace in a series of fin de siècle literary adaptations. Oil Lamps from 1970, from the novel by Jaroslav Havlíček, was a more restrained period piece, but its 1972 follow-up Morgiana was full-blooded Herz, perhaps his most successful feature of the decade. The Russian author of the source novel, Alexander Green, was an outcast who died in poverty, shooting crows in the park with a homemade crossbow for food. Perhaps his life story appealed to the director as much as the paranoid chamber drama of sororal blackmail and murder. The result is perhaps the most purely gothic creation of Hertz's career, a full-blown haunted house story replete with eerie mirrors and heavy cobwebs. Perhaps predictably, Ludwig Thiemann, the chief commissioning editor of the state-run Barrandov film studio, accused Herz of sadomasochism and banished him to television productions for 2 years. When Morgiana won top prize at the Chicago International Film Festival, Herz did not find out until 7 years later. When he was allowed to return to feature filmmaking, Herz turned to the politically neutral ground of fairy tale. He was offered the chance to adapt Beauty and the Beast, which I wanted, he recalled, because I knew I could include horror scenes. But he was forced to shoot a second fantasy film, The Ninth Heart, at the same time in order to cut costs. Both were released in 1978, cementing Herz's reputation as a maestro of the macabre and as a talented conjurer of atmosphere. The pulpiest and schlockiest of Herz's films came 4 years later with Verrat Vampire, a John Carpenter-style horror comedy about a car that runs on human blood. If that film is the clearest example of a pure horror genre work in the Herz catalogue, it was yet another nightmare of a production subject to endless cuts and critiques. The director renounced the final cut and once again found himself cut short by the authorities. Despite all this, though, his race was not yet run. In the doldrums of his latest ban, Herz came across an article mooting a potential film about Ravensbrück. Despite his pariah status at the time, he asked the head of the Barrandov studio for permission to take charge of the project. And he was in luck. The film had been assigned to his old ally, Jaromil Jureš, who relinquished it to him. Somehow, after all that had befallen him, Herz found himself now with the opportunity to return to the scene of his own formative tragedy. The place, in his own words, that had instilled in him his impulses towards horror and black comedy. The resulting film, Caught by the Night from 1986, is nominally based on the memoirs of a fellow Holocaust survivor and Czech communist journalist called Jožka Jaburkova, although Herz based his depiction of Ravensbrück on his own experiences. The film's use of suspense sequences and surreal, haunting flashbacks borrow directly from the horror playbook in an attempt to represent the psychological state of the Holocaust victim. The film is like a Rosetta Stone for the preceding years of Herz's career. In 1987, Herz finally emigrated to West Germany, his work in his native land complete. I had been trying to make a film about a concentration camp using black humour for 20 years, he later claimed, and everybody was horrified of mixing the suffering and terror of the Holocaust with humour. But I think Caught by the Night is my greatest horror. It is a real horror. There is no blood, but it is unwatchable for people with weak nerves. That is the atmosphere I experienced. Against the odds, Herz had fashioned an oeuvre that pushed the limits of communist probity in mapping out a territory for Eastern European horror. To quote him once again, for me, the typical horror film is a chainsaw massacre, and of course, this wasn't possible to do during the socialist era. His influence on the genre in the region remains profound. You can see it in contemporary folk horror hybrids, like fellow Slovak Ivo Trojkov's The Ballad of Piaggi, for instance. We should celebrate one of Czech and Slovak cinema's most insistently vital voices, and not turn away from the brutal history that inspired his most haunting visions, nor its echoes in our lives today. That was Caught by the Night, the Gothic Visions of Juraj Herz, written and read by Sam Goff. You can find this and other essays, companions and watch lists on our journal at klassiki.online/journal. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to find the original essay, to browse our collection of classic Czech and Slovak titles, and to explore some of the films mentioned in this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to this show on your podcast app, and please leave us a review and a 5-star rating to help us reach as many people as possible. Thank you.